7.7 talks about these things called complex numbers. And so complex numbers has basically two parts. And the first part of these things is called imaginary numbers. And when we're doing imaginary numbers, there's a couple of definitions we need to know. And the first one here is that, I is equal to the square root of negative 1, and I squared is equal to negative 1. All right, and we have a definition right here, and it says the square root of negative a equals the square root of negative 1 times the square root of a, and the square root of negative 1 is what we're calling I. So I'm going to go through these problems here and see if we can't make sense of these. So I want you to notice the first problem I have here is the square root of negative 25. So I'm going to rewrite that as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 25. Well, by definition, the square root of negative 1 is what we call I. So I'm going to put a little I right there. And then I already know the square root of 25 is 5. So my answer is just going to be 5i. All right, I'll do the next one exactly the same way. The square root of negative 100, I'm going to rewrite that as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 100. All right, again, we already know the square root of negative 1 is what we call I. The square root of 100 is 10, and so my answer is 10i. Let's try the next one. We'll do it exactly the same way. So I have the square root of negative 50. I'm going to rewrite that as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 50. Well, I already know the square root of negative 1 is I. Now, I need to see if I can break down 50. So I'm going to write 50 up here. I know that that's 5 and 10. I know that that's 5 and 2. So I have a pair of 5s. So the number that's going to come outside is the 5. And the number that's going to stay on the inside is the 2. So my answer would be 5i times the square root of 2. Okay, I'm going to scroll down a little bit so we can try the next ones here. Okay, let's try this one. So this negative square root of 81. The first thing I notice is I have this negative on the outside, so I already know at the very end my answer is going to be negative. Okay, so since I have the square root of negative 81, since there's a negative on the inside, the first thing I know I'm going to be able to write is my I. And the square root of 81 is 9, so my answer would just be negative 9i. All right, let's try this one here. Again, the square root of negative 24, I'm going to rewrite that as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 24. Again, I remember the square root of negative 1 is I. I'm going to take my number 24 and I'm going to break it down. So 24 is, say, 4 times 6. 4 is 2 and 2. 6 is 3 and 2. Well, we have a pair, the pair of the number 2, so the 2 is going to come outside. This 3 and this 2 aren't paired up, so I'm going to go ahead and multiply them, and that number goes back on the inside. So again, my answer here, 2i times the square root of 6. Okay, let's try this one here. So first thing, the square root of negative 5, I'm going to rewrite that as I, because there's that negative 1, times the square root of 5. The square root of negative 2, I'm going to rewrite that as I times the square root of 2. Because again, I can think about that as, say, the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 5. The square root of negative 1, we already said, was our I part. Okay, same thing with the 2. Now, I'm just going to multiply straight across. So I times I is going to leave me with an I squared. 5 times 2 is going to leave me with a square root of 10. If I scroll back and I look at the top part of my notes up here, it tells me right here, let me circle it again, but I'll circle it in red. It says I squared is equal to negative 1. So when I sort of come back here to my problem, since I squared is negative 1, that's just going to make that the negative square root of 10. Again, I can break down 10, but it's only a 5 and a 2, so I can't simplify it. The next one here, I'll do it the same way. Because I have a square root of negative 7, I'm going to write I times the square root of 7. Since I have the square root of negative 3, I'm going to write I times the square root of 3. So again, I times I squared. 7 times 3 is 21. So I squared again is negative 1. That just makes that into the negative square root of 21. Okay, so the next problem here is the square root of negative 36 times the square root of negative 4. Okay, so my first step here, I have a negative on the inside. I'm going to write I. Now, I know the square root of 36. The square root of 36 is just 6. Okay, the next one, the square root of negative 4. There's a negative on the inside. I'm going to write my I. But I know the square root of 4. The square root of 4 is just 2. So I'm going to multiply straight across. 6 times 2 is 12. I times another I is I squared. So 12 times I squared, if you remember I squared was negative 1, that's going to be 12 times a negative 1. That just gives me a negative 12. Okay, so now for the next one, this is a division problem. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to write one big square root, the square root of negative 9 divided by 3. Well, negative 9 divided by 3 is a negative 3. Since I have that negative on the inside, I'm going to go ahead and bring out the I. But I can't simplify the square root of 3, so I'm going to leave that part alone. For the next one, I'll do it the same way. I'm going to write negative 40 divided by negative 8 in one big square root. Well, negative 8 goes into negative 40 a positive 5 times. I don't have any more negatives. There's no reason for me to write an I here. That's just my answer. So again, the only time I write the I is if I have a negative on the inside. You can see that a negative divided by negative is a positive, so there's no I here. Okay, so these next problems are just asking me to either add or subtract. So guys, and when you're doing these problems here, you want to go slow, because a lot of times people tend to want to FOIL it out, but all I'm doing is really combining like terms. So when I combine like terms, I can combine my 1 with my negative 6. That's going to leave me with a negative 5. We can also combine our positive 8i with our positive 3i to give me a positive 11i. So in the next problem, this one is asking me to subtract. So if you remember, when I'm going to subtract, my first part here, I'm not going to do anything with it. I'm just going to write 6 minus 2i. Since I have that minus sign here, I'm going to think about that as a negative 1, and I'm going to distribute that negative 1 to both parts. So that's now going to give me a negative 3. A negative 1 times a negative 5i is a positive 5i. Now I'm just going to combine like terms. 6 minus 3 is 3. Minus 2i and a plus 5i is a plus 3i. And the next one here, I'll do it exactly the same way. The first part, I'm just going to rewrite it. 3 minus 4i. Again, since this is a subtraction problem, I'm going to think about there as a negative 1, and I'll distribute that negative 1 to both parts. So that's going to give me a plus 2i. A negative 1 times a negative 18i is a positive 18i. So, oops, I'm sorry, there was not an I there. Let me fix that. That was my mistake. So that was just a positive 2. I'm sorry, I said a 2i, but it was just a positive 2. Okay, so now let's go ahead and go back. So let's see, 3 plus 2, that's a positive 5. A negative 4i and a positive 18i should give me a positive 14i. And there's my answer. So let me scroll down again to the next couple of problems. And here it says to multiply, we're going to write it in the form a plus bi. I'll explain what that means in a minute. So again, I'm just going to multiply straight across. So negative 10 times a negative 4 is a positive 40. I times I is going to leave me with I squared. If you recall from the page before, we said I squared was equal to negative 1. So now 40 times negative 1, just a negative 40. Now, the next one I'll do it the same way. Negative 2 times negative 11 is a positive 22. I times I will give me an I squared. So that's going to be 22 times negative 1 is a negative 22. And my third one here. I'm going to go ahead and distribute once, twice. So 6i times 2 is a 12i. 6i times a negative 3i should give me a negative 18i squared. So I'm going to go ahead and write this as 12i minus 18. We said I squared was negative 1. Now I want you to notice, when I multiply these two together, a negative 18 and a negative 1 is going to give me a positive 18. So I'm going to write that down first. And then after that, I'm going to go ahead and write this part next. And if you notice, the sign of my 12i is a positive. So I'm going to write it as plus 12i. Now, I want to explain why I'm going to write it this way. If you look, let me get a different color pen. Let's go blue. If you look right here, it says we're going to write it in the form a plus bi. All that means is that the part that has the I is going to come second. If you notice the problem that we did up here, the I came second. If you look at this one, the I came second. And if you look at this one here, the I came second. So that's sort of the standard form of how we write a complex number. So a complex number actually has two parts. It has the part that doesn't have the I, and then it has the part that does have the I. And the part that has the I always comes in second. Okay. All right, continuing with 7.7, let's try the next problem here. So again, I'm going to go ahead and distribute. Oops. So 5i times 4 is going to give me a 20i. 5i times a negative 7i should give me a negative 35i squared. So I'm going to keep writing. That's going to give me 20i minus 35. We said I squared was a negative 1. Now again, if I look at these two, when I multiply them, a negative 35 times a negative 1 is going to give me a positive 35. And I still have that plus 20i. All right. So the next problem here, I'm going to do it the same way, but all I need to do really is FOIL this thing out. So we're going to go once, twice. So 2 times 4 is going to leave me with an 8. 2 times a plus I will give me a plus 2i. Now, negative 5i times 4, negative 20i. Negative 5i times a positive I would give me a negative 5i squared. Okay? So now, I'm going to go ahead and do the next part. I can combine these two terms here. They're like terms. So a plus 2i and a minus 20i is going to give me a negative 18i. I'll write my plus 8 after that. And then remember, that's negative 5. We said I squared was negative 1. Okay, so I'll continue to write negative 18i plus 8. Now again, right here, negative 5 times negative 1 is a positive 5. So 8 plus 5 will actually give me a 13, and then a minus 18i. Okay, so I'm going to try the next one. I'm going to do the same process here. I'm just going to FOIL once, twice. Oops. Okay, so 2 times 6, let me get a different color pen just so it doesn't look so much the same. Okay, so 2 times 6 is going to give me 12. 2 times negative I, a negative 2i. 3i times 6 is a plus 18i. 3i times a negative I, negative 3i squared. Okay, so now let's go ahead and combine like terms. Negative 2i plus 18i, 16i. So plus 12 minus 3, I squared we said is negative 1. So I'm going to go ahead and continue here. 16i plus 12. Negative 3 times negative 1 is a plus 3. We can combine those terms together. That's going to give me a 15 plus 16i. And we're done. Okay, so for the next multiplication problem here, it's 3 minus I in parentheses squared. So I'm going to go ahead and write this as, as 3 minus I, times another 3 minus I, and I'll just start filling it out. So 3 times 3 is going to give me 9. 3 times negative I, negative 3I. A negative I times 3 is another negative 3I. And a negative I times a negative I should give me a positive I squared. So just like we've been doing before, I'm going to continue. I'm going to go ahead and combine those. Notice they're both negative, so that's going to leave me with a negative 6I plus 9 plus, we said I squared is the number negative 1. So now I can go ahead and combine all my terms. 9 plus negative 1 gives me an 8, and then I have a minus 6I after that. And we're done. Okay, so for the last part here, let's figure out how we divide complex numbers. So in dividing complex numbers, what we're going to do is we're always going to look at the denominator every single time. And what we're going to do is we're going to multiply the top and the bottom by the same denominator with one minor exception. We're going to change the sign of the middle term. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go multiply. If this is a 4 plus 3i, if that's a 4 plus 3i, what I'm going to write here is a 4 minus 3i. And whatever I write on the bottom, I'm going to write the same thing on the top. Okay? So again, notice the only thing that's different, this one here is positive, that one there is negative. That's always going to be the only difference. And I'm going to do the same thing for, that problem and that problem as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and go straight across. Let me change my color here just so it doesn't look the same. All right, so now I'm going to multiply. 7 times 4 is 28. 7 times a negative 3i, negative 21 with an I. Okay, so to do the bottom part, I'm going to go ahead and FOIL it out. So 4 times 4 is 16. 4 times negative 3i should be a negative 12i. A positive 3i times 4 should give me a positive 12i. And then a positive 3i times a negative 3i should give me a negative 9i squared. Let me erase some of that here. Maybe not so much. There we go. Okay, so now I'm going to look at the bottom part, and I want to see if there's things that I can simplify. Well, these 12i's are actually going to cancel. So I'm going to rewrite this as 28 minus 21 with an I. The bottom part is going to be 16 minus 9 times negative 1. So that's going to be 28 minus 21i. That's going to actually become 16 plus 9. So 16 plus 9 should give me, what, 25? So now, guys, the only thing I'm going to do here, I'm going to separate my fraction. I'm going to write that as 28 over 25 minus 21 over 25 with an I. And again, the way I'm getting the 25, when I add those two numbers together, that gives me 25. Now, the reason I'm separating them is just like we were doing before, we're writing the A plus BI. This kind of like my A plus BI part. Okay. All right. Let's try the next one. So again, I'm going to look at the bottom part. The first thing I see here is 4 minus 3i. So I'm going to multiply by 4 plus 3i. And I'm going to do that both, on the top, and on the bottom. Okay, so let's go straight across. Let's see. 6 times 4, I'll write it over here, 24. 6 times 3i should give me a plus 18i. 2i times 4 plus 8i. 2i times 3i plus 6i squared. Okay. Now I'll do the bottom part. 4 times 4 is 16. 4 times 3i plus 12i. Negative 3i times 4 minus 12i. Negative 3i times positive 3i, negative 9i squared. Okay, so let's go ahead and worry about combining like terms. So I'll take care of the top. So I'm going to write 24. We can combine these together. That's going to give me a plus 26i. Now, if I squared is negative 1, and that's a positive 6, 6 times negative 1 should give me a negative 6. On the bottom part here, these are going to cancel. So I'm going to have 16. Again, if I squared is negative 1, that's going to be a negative 9 times a negative 1. That's going to give me a positive 9. Okay, so now let's take care of the top. 24 minus 6 should give me an 18 minus, or plus, I'm sorry, 26 with an I. If I do the bottom part, 16 plus 9 again is 25, so I'm going to write 25 here, 25 here, and there's my answer. Okay, so let's try the last one. First thing I notice, I look at the bottom part, it's 2 plus I. Okay, so I'm going to do the opposite of the middle term. Sorry. I'm going to do 2 minus I. And again, it's always just changing the sign of the middle term, and always of the one on the bottom. I never worry about what's on the top. I'll just deal with that as I go through. Okay, so let's go ahead and FOIL it out. 6 times 2, 12. 6 times negative I, negative 6i. Negative I times 2, negative 2i. Negative I times a positive I is a positive I squared. Now let's do the bottom part. 2 times 2 is 4. 2 times a negative I, negative 2i. Positive I times 2, positive 2i. Positive I times negative I, negative I squared. Okay, now I'm going to combine like terms. So on the top, I'm going to have a 12. Minus 6i minus 2i is a minus 8i. I squared is negative 1. On the bottom, these two i's are going to cancel. So that's going to be 4 minus, we said I squared was negative 1. So now I'm going to go ahead and start simplifying some things here. 12 plus a negative 1 is an 11. Now I have a minus 8 with an I. On the bottom part, 4 minus a negative 1, doesn't that actually become a 4 plus 1, which is going to give me 5. So I'm going to go ahead and separate my fraction. And there's my answer.